$100 and put it down.
Yeah.
Capture, not capture.
Yeah. Right now, middle. Now you see? Yeah. But for now, দিতে পারো, চেঞ্জ করে দিয়েছি আবার তা।
এটা দেখো যদি মনে হয় যে
একটু ছাড়া
shall we start? Mani, if you are ready?
Yeah, I'm ready.
Yes. So I will get that paper.
আমরা যে মন্দির লিখতে শুনি আমাদের ছবিও নিই, খালি বউয়ের ছবি নিলে হবে না। শোনো, দেখি খালি বউয়ের ছবি নিই, খালি ওই পেছনে গান করা যখন গান করবো না আরে থাকবো আমার ছবিটা ভারী উঠছে না, তুমি খালি বউয়ের ছবি নিচ্ছ, এসব চলবে না। আমার এত ঘুম পাচ্ছে আমি একটু ঘুমিয়ে করি, ঘুম পাচ্ছে। আমি জয়াকে ফোন করেছিলাম, আস্তে আস্তে
গঙ্গা জল আছে?
হ্যাঁ,
কোনটা?
এটা না?
Yes, that's a গঙ্গা জল। Light up, light. The lamp or the dhoop? Which one? Dhoop.
Oh, yes.
You barely have
No,
any.
no.
Huh?
Oh, lighter.
ওই বড় ক্যান্ডেলটা
বড় ক্যান্ডেলটা জ্বালাতে বলবো? Yes. No, yes.
Should I sit here? Or?
Yes.
Yes.
Shall I start with intro?
With?
Shall I start with intro?
Yeah.
Sakhana bhavatu, sakhana
प्रणव पुनर्तु सह वीर्यं करवावहै तेजस्विनावतीतमस्तु मा विद्विषावहै ॐ शान्ति शान्ति शान्तिः. Pranams to Thakur, Mas Swamiji, and the pranams to Swami. Namaste to all. Thanks for coming over here this evening. And this week we have been celebrating Krishna Jayanti in all the places. So we will start with the bhajan on Shri Krishna and one more on Devi, and followed by we will introduce Swami, and we can get started with Swami's discourse on Is the World Unreal. So let's go with the bhajan now. It's going to be solo. It's on Krishna. Mandara giridhara madana manohara मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर गिरिधारी गिरिधारी गोवर्धनधर गिरिधारी 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 गोवर्धनधर गिरिधारी माधवा मधुसूदना मुरली गानविलोला मंदर गिरिधर मदन मनोहर मीरा के प्रभु गिरिधर नागर गिरिधारी गिरिधारी गोवर्धनधर गिरिधारी 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 गोवर्धनधर गिरिधारी माधवा मधुसूदना मुरली गानविलोला मंदर गिरिधर मदन मनोहर. Next on Devi. मंगल शुभगरी माता महेश्वरी मंगल शुभकरी माता महेश्वरी अम्बे भवानी अखिलांडेश्वरी अम्बे भवानी अखिलांडेश्वरी मंगल शुभकरी माता महेश्वरी राजीव लोचनी राजराजेश्वरी राजीव लोचनी राजराजेश्वरी आदि पराशक्ति श्री परमेश्वरी आदि पराशक्ति श्री परमेश्वरी आनंद रूपिणी हे शिव शंकरी आनंद रूपिणी हे शिव शंकरी मंगल शुभकरी माता महेश्वरी अम्बे भवानी अखिलांडेश्वरी मंगल शुभकरी माता महेश्वरी राजीव लोचनी राजराजेश्वरी आदि पराशक्ति श्री परमेश्वरी आनंद रूपिणी हे शिव शंकरी आनंद रूपिणी हे शिव शंकरी मंगल मंगल शुभकरी माता महेश्वरी. Before I introduce Swami, a brief logistics, and Swami will be giving the discourse. Is the world is unreal for about until around 5:10, 5:15 around that time, and then there will be a Q&A session, and by around 5:25 we will conclude the discourse session. Then we'll be having a very short stretching break, that is for about 3 to 4 minutes, and 5:30 we will assemble for Aarti. After the Aarati, there will be a brief 10 minutes meditation. So after that, we will disperse. On the way, the days of prasads to go will be available. And please collect your prasad at that time and you may go. We are so blessed to have Swami Medhananda here this evening. And Swami is visiting us for the very first time. So, that is what a wonderful, occasion for all of us to have him. And welcome Swami to our center. And we look forward to your visit, every now and then, whenever an opportunity arises. We all look forward. And today is unfortunately, not many people are present, but, usually it will be more, that is at summertime. I don't know. We expect that, the recent future, that's more people will be attending. Please welcome. About Swami, Swami Medhananda was born and raised in Boston. He received his PhD in German philosophy from the University of California at Berkeley, and also studied at Oxford University and Humboldt University in Berlin. Initiated by Swami Medhanandaji Maharaj, he joined Ramakrishna Order in 2010 at Vivekananda University in Belur, where he served as associate professor and head of program in philosophy from 2010 to 2021. He received Sannyasa Diksha from Swami Medhanandaji Maharaj in 2020. From 2021 to 2022, he served as a senior research fellow in philosophy at the Ramakrishna Institute of Moral and Spiritual Education in Mysore, before coming to Vedanta Society of Southern California in Hollywood in August 2022, where he has been serving as senior research fellow in philosophy. He is also the Hindu chaplain at both the University of California, Los Angeles and the University of Southern California. He is the author of 3 books, Swami Vivekananda's Vedantic Cosmopolitanism, which is published by Oxford University in 2022. Then the next book is on Infinite Paths to Infinite Reality, Sri Ramakrishna and the Cross-Cultural Philosophy of Religion. It is also published by Oxford University Press in 2018. And the third one being The Dialectics of Aesthetic Agency, Reevaluating German Aesthetics from Kant to Adorno. It was published by Bloomsbury in 2013. He is the editor of Bloomsbury Research Handbook of Vedanta 2020 and a co-editor with Benedict Paul Gauquet of Panentheism in Indian and Western Thought, Cosmopolitan Interventions, Routledge 2023. He has published over 30 articles in international academic journals. He has been invited to deliver lectures or keynotes at Princeton University, Oxford University, WWU Munster University, Vasudeva University, Japan, and the Indian Institute of Advanced Study, among other institutions. He is currently writing a book on karma and rebirth in Hinduism, which is under contract with Cambridge University Press. And with that small introduction about Swami, and on behalf of VVCC, I am so blessed, and we are also blessed to that is request Swami to start his discourse. Thank you, Swami. Please.
Thank you so much. Oh, is this working? It seems like it's not. Devashi, can you bring some water for me? Yes. Hari Om. It doesn't seem to be working. Yeah. Oh, now is it Hari Om? Yeah, now it's working. So if we just Hari Om, that's it.
Yeah.
It's okay now, right?
Yeah.
Good. Okay, so should I begin?
Yes.
Okay. Om Sthapakaya cha dharmasya sarva dharmasvarupini avatara varishtaya Ramakrishnaya te namaha. Good afternoon, everyone. Nice to see all of you. It's wonderful to be visiting this center for the first time here in Connecticut. I'm very impressed with the overall infrastructure and how dedicated the devotees are. And I look forward to seeing it thrive and prosper in the future because I can see so much potential here. So it's wonderful to be here. Thank you for having me. Thank you for attending. So a few months ago, I spoke to Rakima about the topic. of this talk. And to get a sense of the audience, I asked her, what do other Swamis speak about? So she said, well, when Sarvapriyananda comes, he gives a class on Aparokshanubhuti. So I thought, okay, so they like, this audience is like a hardcore philosophical audience. Let me come up with a hardcore philosophical topic. And so I set the topic as, is the world unreal? And then I found out much later that maybe you guys are more interested in practical things. I'm not sure. So what I'm going to do today, as a kind of compromise, is blend together philosophy with some more practical tips on sadhana, on spiritual practice. So I hope I please both the hardcore philosophers in the audience, if there are any, and the people who are more interested in, what do I do right now in my spiritual practice? How does this help me in my daily life? So I'll do a little bit of both. And I also want to make this more of an interactive class rather than just a kind of lecture. So please feel free to chime in. I might ask questions. So ideally, some of you will answer the question. If the room is silent, then it's going to become awkward. Okay. So let's begin. So the topic is the world unreal. This is one of those huge philosophical questions that philosophers throughout the world have raised for millennia. Descartes raised it in the West. A great Chinese philosopher, ancient Chinese philosopher, raised the question, is this all a dream? And Indian philosophers have been asking this question for many, many, many hundreds of years. So this is a question of perennial philosophical interest. And it's not just a philosophical interest, it has direct practical implications. And I want to explain what some of those implications are. So let's begin by looking at one passage from the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna in the original Bangla. So this is a wonderful text. I'm sure all of you have read at least parts of this text in whatever language you prefer. So I'm going to read from December 16th, 1883. M, who's the author of the Gospel, he was a highly educated person. And he studied different Indian philosophies, studied different Western philosophies. And then he comes to Sri Ramakrishna. And so, with this in the background, he asks the following question. Muni is M's name. Jagat ki mithya? Is this Jagat mithya? Is this world unreal? That's the question. Sri Ramakrishna answers as follows. মিথ্যা কেন? ওসব বিচারের কথা। প্রথমটা নেতি নেতি বিচার করবার সময় তিনি জীব নন, জগৎ নন, চতুর্বিংশী তত্ত্ব নন হয়ে যায়। এসব স্বপ্নবৎ হয়ে যায়। তারপর অনুলোম বিলোম, তখন তিনিই জীব জগৎ হয়েছেন বোধ হয়। Okay. How does Sri Ramakrishna answer M's very provocative question, is this world unreal? Sri Ramakrishna says the following, মিথ্যা কেন? Why should this world be unreal? ওসব বিচারের কথা। See, this is a bit of a tricky sentence. Medhanandaji, in his English translation, he translates this sentence, ওসব বিচারের কথা, as this is a matter for philosophical discussion. What I would humbly suggest, now, first of all, let me just mention that Nikhanji's English translation of the Gospel is incredibly good. It's a masterful translation. First of all, because he's one of the few monks in the order who had a very profound understanding of the English language. He was a journalist. I think he was trained as a journalist before he became a monk. And so just at the level of style, it's incredibly poetic, spiritually powerful, and extremely accurate because his mother tongue was Bengali. So he really knew both languages extremely well. And so it's really an incredible translation. But I think there are places where certain words or phrases can be made more accurate. So I think this is one of those places. Sri Ramakrishna says, why should this world be unreal? Oshab vichare kotha. Now, the thing is, Nikhilanji is suggesting that he's taking vichara. Everything depends on context, you see. Vichara in Bengali, vichar, can mean different things in different contexts. In general, it means reasoning. And Nikhilanandaji takes it in this very general sense. That is a matter for philosophical discussion. What I would suggest is the subsequent context, the next few sentences, specify the exact kind of reasoning that Sri Ramakrishna had in mind. So now let's look, then we'll come back to this sentence, and I'll suggest maybe a more accurate way of translating this sentence. So what's the context? What are the next sentences? প্রথমটা নেতি নেতি বিচার করবার সময় তিনি জীব নন, জগৎ নন, চতুর্বিংশী তত্ত্ব নন হয়ে যায়, এসব স্বপ্নবৎ হয়ে যায়. See, Sri Ramakrishna is explaining exactly what he means by vichara in these sentences. He says there are two stages in this reasoning. First, neti neti vichar korbar shomoy. Actually, the first stage is the stage of reasoning, the stage of vichara. He's saying, prothomta, at first, do neti neti vichara. So now the first question comes. So I'm hoping somebody will be able to, a brave soul will answer my question. The question is this: neti neti vichara. Sri Ramakrishna is referring to neti neti vichara. Which Upanishad does this neti neti vichara come from? There's a specific Upanishad which refers to neti neti, which uses those words. Anybody, any expert in the Upanishads who knows? Which Upanishad? No, not Katha Upanishad. Two more guesses. One of the most ancient Upanishads with the name that's very difficult to pronounce. That's my hint. Brihadaranyaka Upanishad. So in the Brihadaranyaka Upanishad, Brahman itself is defined as neti neti, as not this, not this. So what does that mean? Sri Ramakrishna, even though he wasn't educated in the formal sense, in the traditional sense, he was a genius, not just a spiritual genius, he was an intellectual genius. And he could remember everything he heard. And so many Pandits would come to him and recite from the scriptures, from the Upanishads, from the Bhagavad Gita. He kept some books with him. One of his favorites was Bipin Bihari Ghoshal's Muktiyotah Sadhan, Liberation and Spiritual Practices for Attaining Liberation. It's a very interesting book. It's a Bengali compilation of different scriptures arranged topic-wise. So one topic would be Ishvara, God. And then it will give you passages from Bhagavad Gita, which talk about God, Upanishads about God, and many texts, very eclectic range of texts coming from Tantra like Mahanirvana Tantra. You get Advaita Vedanta texts like Panchadashi, Aparokshanubhuti, I think, is in there, the text that Sarvapinaji teaches here. So many texts. And so we think that, well, he was not educated, he was almost illiterate. No, he had everything at his fingertips. He knew all these texts, actually. Okay, so that's just a kind of aside. But coming back here to Sri Ramakrishna's, what he's saying. At first, we have to reason. What kind of reasoning? Neti neti vichara. Not this, not this. And then Sri Ramakrishna explains what is exactly neti neti vichara. You see, it's mentioned in the Upanishad. Sri Ramakrishna, as somebody who has realized God and is himself God, he's speaking with authority about what exactly this not this kind of vichara is. Neti neti reasoning. He says, প্রথমটা নেতি নেতি বিচার করবার সময় তিনি জীব নন, জগৎ নন, চতুর্বিংশী তত্ত্ব নন হয়ে যায়, এসব স্বপ্নবৎ হয়ে যায়. So, what is he saying? During this phase of reasoning, you should say, Brahman is not anything I see in this world. Jeev non, it's none. Brahman is not any of these individual souls. Jagat non, Brahman is not anything that I see in this universe. None of the names and forms I see, not the chairs, not the tables, nothing. Choturbinshi tattva non, Brahman is in fact none of the 24 cosmic principles. What are the 24 cosmic principles? This comes from Sankhya philosophy, and I'm not going to go into the details, but it covers everything in this world without any exception. Nothing is left out. And Brahman is nothing in this world. This is what neti neti vichara means. Brahman is not this, Brahman is not that, Brahman is not that, right? And then you might ask, well, what's left? We'll get to that. Then Sri Ramakrishna says, Eshab shopnabhat hoye jay. When we engage in this kind of reasoning, we somehow feel as if this world is a kind of dream. Shopnava. This world becomes like a dream. This sentence gives us the context to understand how to translate the previous sentence. This is my suggestion. When Sri Ramakrishna says, why should this world be unreal? O shab bicharit kotha. He then immediately goes on to explain what kind of vichara he had in mind. He meant neti vichara. He meant the not this kind of reasoning. Practiced by whom? Who practices this kind of vichara? Next question. Any takers? Anyone know the answer? This is not very difficult, actually.
Philosophers.
Not all philosophers.
The individual who wants to.
No. What I'm asking is, this is a very specific kind of reasoning. This whole world is a dream. Brahman is completely separate from this world. Brahman is the only reality.
Advaita.
Advaita Vedanta of Sri Shankaracharya. Exactly. Followers of Shankara's classical Advaita Vedanta are the ones who engage in this vichara. That's the very definition of Jnana Yoga, the path of knowledge, according to Shankara. That's what Sri Ramakrishna is talking about. So now when Sri Ramakrishna says, why should the world be unreal? That's Usham Bicharit Kotha. What he means is, that is how followers of Shankara reason. So I think that would be a more accurate translation of this. Not that as a matter for philosophical discussion, that's much too general. Sri Ramakrishna has in mind a very specific kind of reasoning. What kind of reasoning? Neti vichara. Not this kind of reasoning, practiced by followers of Shankara who look upon this world as a dream. Okay. But Sri Ramakrishna is not finished. Now comes the really important part. He says, তারপর অনুলোম বিলোম তখন তিনি জীব জগৎ হয়েছেন বোধ হয়. There's a lot of philosophy packed into these two sentences. After this first stage of neti reasoning comes anulom bilom, anuloma viloma in Sanskrit. This is very technical in a way. Involution and evolution. Let's say, what does he mean by this? He doesn't give any explanation actually here, but the basic idea is, at the beginning of creation, God evolves as everything in this world. All the names and forms we see are nothing but different manifestations of God. And at the end of creation, at the time of dissolution, what happens? Those same names and forms get involved back into God. This might sound very abstract. The Upanishads, another Upanishad, uses a beautiful analogy to explain how God creates this universe and withdraws it back into itself. The metaphor of a spider. Which Upanishad is the spider analogy found in? Another Upanishadic quiz. Almost. The other M Upanishad. What's the other? Very good. Excellent. She knows her Upanishads. It's from the Mundaka Upanishad. Yathorna nabi srijate grindate cha. And it goes on like that. So just as a spider projects this entire world from out of itself, the cobweb is not different from the spider, actually. It comes out of the spider's own body. Just like that, all the names and forms in this world come from God and are God, not separate from God and not a dream. How can it be a dream if it's God? If everything is God, God is only reality. So how can we dismiss this world as a dream? You see? So just as a spider projects a cobweb out of itself, just so God projects this entire world of names and forms out of itself. And at the time of dissolution, just as a spider will withdraw that cobweb back into itself, this is not necessarily biologically accurate in this, but it's a beautiful metaphor, let's say. Just so God will withdraw all the names and forms of the universe back into itself. And then again, now, all of you as Hindus should know that the doctrine of creation in Hinduism is cyclical. It goes through cycles. There's no such thing as, in Christianity, there's creation out of nothing, ex nihilo. That's not the doctrine of Hinduism. There's no such thing as creation out of nothing. The universe is always there, either in manifest form, as this world of names and forms, that's why we're sitting here now, because we're in this manifest world, or in the seed state, bija avastha. But the world never disappears. all the names and forms in the seed state get contracted back in this tiny seed. And then again at the time of creation, manifestation. So it's the cyclical theory. Good. Seed form, that's involution. Names and forms are involved in God. Then expansion, evolution. And we have this world of names and forms. Then again, at some point, it'll contract back into, we call it the big crunch, maybe. Back into seed form, like that. But the world, now, notice, what's the difference between this first stage of neti vichara, not this kind of reasoning, and this second realization? He explains it even further. After doing this neti reasoning and saying this world is a dream, none of this is real, Brahman alone is real, then he says, you realize that everything in this world, all the names and forms themselves are nothing but God. Then he clarifies it in the next sentence, and this is the end of the passage, and then we can talk more generally about it. Tokon tini jeev jagat hoyechen bodh hoy. This is extremely important. Then you realize, what do you realize? That God herself has become everything in this world. So now my next question is, what is the difference between this first stage of neti reasoning? How does the person engaged in neti reasoning look upon this world? And how does the person in the next stage look upon this world? What is the difference?
Both are, in my view, as a layman, it's conflicting.
Okay, in what
The
sense?
first step, say that nothing in this world is Brahman. Everything is things and everything.
Do we have a mic for people speaking in the audience so that people online can also, I don't know if anyone's watching online, but eventually it'll be uploaded. It'll be better if people online can also hear what the questions are saying. Please.
So in the first one I see, that is nothing, that is in the world is
Not this, yeah.
not this. The second one says that, that is everything is
Brahman.
God.
Yes.
It is Brahman. Okay.
Yes.
And so that means, does it say that, that is, it's nothing, but it's really everything. That's what it conveys.
Yeah, no.
I don't know.
I think your intuition is right. You feel, wait a minute, they seem to be kind of contradictory. These two different outlooks on the world. In that first stage of neti reasoning, the world seems to be a dream. Right?
Yeah.
And then in the next phase, Sri Ramakrishna is saying, then you realize the world is not a dream. That everything in this world is nothing but different manifestations of God. The chair is a real manifestation of God. The table is a real manifestation of God. Each of us is a real manifestation of God. How do we make sense of this? One of the things about the gospel that I love is that when you look at Sri Ramakrishna's teaching, open to any page almost, and you'll find this. There are two kinds of teaching. Extremely lofty spiritual and philosophical teachings about his own spiritual experiences, about high philosophy like we're seeing here, right, in the passage I just read. And we also find incredibly practical, down-to-earth teachings about sadhana, about spiritual practice. And down to the level of if somebody's child has just died, Sri Ramakrishna will cry with them. You see, two very different kinds of teaching. This reminds me of another scripture, which has both high philosophy and extremely practical teachings about spiritual practice, Bhagavad Gita. See, at the end of every chapter, traditionally when you recite the Bhagavad Gita in Sanskrit, you're supposed to recite at the end of each chapter what's called the colophon. Om Tat Saditi Srimad Bhagavad Gita Su Upanishatsu Brahma Vidyayam Yoga Shastre. The Gita in this colophon is described in terms of two words. More words than that, but I want to focus on two words. It's Brahma Vidya. It teaches the highest knowledge of Brahman, the science of Brahman. Very high philosophical and spiritual teachings about the nature of ultimate reality. At the same time, it is a yoga shastra. It's an extremely practical spiritual manual. What should we do as spiritual aspirants on a day-to-day basis? And the beauty of the Gita is that it sees these two things, philosophy and spiritual practice, as inseparable. You cannot have one without the other. Because without philosophy, you don't have any ground to stand on when you engage in spiritual practice. You need a foundation for your spiritual practice. This should remind you, if any of you are familiar with Buddhism. Does anyone know anything about the Four Noble Truths in Buddhism? Nobody? The Four Noble Truths. Does anyone know any of the Noble Truths? Well, yeah, that's under the fourth Noble Truth. First Noble Truth, Sarvam Dukkham. Everything is Dukkham. Okay, I'm not going to give a lecture on Buddhism now, but anyway, let's skip to the fourth Noble Truth, which is what you were mentioning. It's the one that's relevant. The fourth Noble Truth explains the Noble Eightfold Path that should be practiced by all Buddhists. The 8 factors that we have to master in order to attain nirvana, which is the goal of life according to Buddhism. And the very first factor is samyak drishti, the right understanding. On that basis, you can go on to practice mindfulness and all the famous things that we know about Buddhism. Right now, mindfulness is all the rage. Vipassana and all these things. You can't engage in any of the Buddhist spiritual practices properly without a proper understanding of this world, without a proper philosophical foundation. That's why the Gita, if you look at chapter 13, chapter 15, and all over the place, very high philosophical teachings, it'll make your head spin. And at the same time, it teaches very practical teachings about spiritual practice, because the two are inseparable. Philosophy provides a foundation for the spiritual practice. Likewise, in the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna, you might wonder, Sri Ramakrishna was the latest incarnation. So he should be giving us extremely practical teachings. Why didn't he just teach us about sadhana? Wouldn't that have been better? Why give us a headache with philosophy? He did it. He wanted to give us a headache because we need to have headaches first in order to do the spiritual practice properly. He could have just given teachings on spiritual practice, but he didn't. On almost every page, you'll find very, very lofty philosophical teachings. And then he explains how we should engage in spiritual practice on the basis of these philosophical teachings. That's the idea. So now, coming back to this passage. On almost every page of the gospel, you'll find that Sri Ramakrishna distinguishes between 2 stages in spiritual experience. Both of them are very high stages in spiritual experience. He gives them 2 different names. He says Jnana and Vijnana. And he says somewhere, Jnana pore Vijnana. After Jnana comes Vijnana. And what I'd suggest is that this first stage of neti reasoning corresponds to what Sri Ramakrishna calls Jnana. And that second phase, when you stop that not this reasoning and you realize that everything is God, that corresponds to the next and the greatest spiritual experience, which he called Vijnana. So what did he mean by Jnana and Vijnana? That's the next question. He explains it in many other places in the gospel. I won't go into the details, I'll just summarize. He says, imagine that you're climbing up a staircase to get up to the roof. He says, as you climb up the stairs, you're engaging in neti vichara, that first phase. Brahman is not this staircase, it's not this, not that, not that. Until the person reaches the roof. What does the roof signify? According to Sri Ramakrishna, reaching the roof signifies the attainment of nirvikalpa samadhi. Brahmajnana, knowledge of non-dual pure consciousness. This is the highest goal for followers of Shankaracharya. Okay? That person reaches the roof. What does he realize? That person realizes that Shankara's philosophy is captured in a very simple formula, which Sri Ramakrishna repeats in many places in the gospel. You probably know it. Sanskrit, Brahma Satyam, Jagat Mithya. It's that formula that M, the author of the gospel, had in mind when he asked Sri Ramakrishna. But is that true? Jagat ki Mithya. See, he uses the same language. Jagat ki Mithya. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. He knows this famous teaching of Shankara's. Is that true, O Sri Ramakrishna? Because I've taken refuge at your feet. Is what Shankara says true? And Sri Ramakrishna gives an extremely subtle answer. He doesn't say it's not quite true. He doesn't say it's false either. He's not saying it's fully true. He's not saying it's entirely wrong either. He's saying it's the first phase in spiritual experience. He says when you realize Brahman, your true nature as non-dual pure consciousness, when you come back from the state of samadhi, what happens? You look upon this world as a dream. You really do feel Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. But he says that's not the end of spiritual experience. There's a next phase in spiritual life, which he calls vijnana. Now coming back to the person standing on the roof, he says, after reaching the roof, the vijnani is the one who realizes, he looks back on the staircase and says, wait a minute, but the roof is made of the same material as the staircase, bricks, lime, and brick dust. That means the very things that I rejected as a dream, as unreal, as not Brahman, now I see are nothing but different real manifestations of Brahman itself. The chairs that I said were not Brahman, now I realize each one of them is a real manifestation of God. The table that I said was not Brahman, now I see the table itself is a real manifestation of God. All the people I saw as part of my dream, now I realize that those people are different real manifestations of God. See, Sri Ramakrishna, when he says this, he's not talking from the standpoint of an intellectual. He was not a dry intellectual. He spoke on the basis of his own spiritual experience. So just a few paragraphs later, he comes back to M's question, is this world unreal? And he says, Jagat mitha keno hobe, o sob bicharer kotha. He repeats the same statement again. That stuff, that's what you say, the world is unreal, the Jagat is mithya, in the stage of neti reasoning. Then he says, তাঁকে দর্শন হলে তখন বোঝা যায় যে তিনি জীবজগৎ হয়েছেন আমায় মা কালী ঘরে দেখিয়ে দিলেন যে মাই সব হয়েছে. It's a beautiful description. He says, and after saying, but the next phase, after this neti reasoning, you look upon everything in this world as a real manifestation of God. He immediately says, Divine Mother herself, his beloved Kali, revealed to me that everything in this world is consciousness, divine consciousness. He says, I was doing, and then he explains in Bangla, I'm just going to paraphrase. He says, I'm doing puja one day in the Kali temple, and the puja vessels I'm using, I see as divine consciousness. The door sill, I see as divine consciousness. A cat walks into the room, Biral. I don't see the cat just as a cat, I see it as a manifestation of the same divine mother, divine consciousness. And I start worshiping the cat, says Sri Ramakrishna. And people think I'm crazy. You see, so this is a direct spiritual experience. So what does it mean? It means that Sri Ramakrishna himself has passed through both of these spiritual stages, which he calls Jnana and Vijnana. He reached the roof. Under Totapuri, he practiced classical Advaitic sadhana. He attained knowledge of Brahman. But then what? Divine Mother tells him in the state of Samadhi, when he's about to leave his body, she says, Bhavamukha thako. Remain in the state of Bhavamukha. It's a very unusual term. What I would suggest, following Swami Tapasanandaji, he was a great monk of our order, a former vice president. He said what Sri Ramakrishna means by Bhavamukha is the same as Vijnana. Divine Mother is telling Sri Ramakrishna to come back from the state of Samadhi and to be a Vijnani. Sri Ramakrishna himself will say that Vijnani goes between the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi and comes back to this world and sees everything as God. Like a boat running a race between the sixth and seventh planes of consciousness. This is what he says. Okay, so now, if jnana, the spiritual realization of jnana, corresponds to Shankara's philosophy, which is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, what does Vijnana correspond to? So in my own academic work, I have made a case that Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy is best understood as Vijnana Vedanta. He's giving us a new philosophy. When I say new, it doesn't mean a new sampradaya, yet another, a competing philosophy among others. No, this is a philosophy that harmonizes all of the existing philosophies. Samanvaya Vedanta. It's a harmonizing philosophy. And if we were to put it in a formula, we can put it in the following Sanskrit formula. Shankara's philosophy is Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta can be captured in this formula. Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Now for the first difference, notice Shankara says Brahma Satyam. I'm saying Sri Ramakrishna will say Brahma Shakti Satyam. This is an interesting phrase, Brahma Shakti. Yes, you have a question? Please.
Yeah, because the Brahma is, with Shakti is different thing than Brahma, isn't it?
Just give her the mic, then she can ask that.
Brahma is totally different from the Brahma Shakti. So how can it be these two?
Good question. what does Sri Ramakrishna say about Brahman? What does he say about Shakti? One of his most famous teachings.
Yeah.
Brahma Shakti Abhed.
Uh-huh.
Brahma or Shakti Abhed. Brahman, by which he means non-dual, Nirguna Brahman.
Right.
And by Shakti, what does he mean by Shakti?
Which is, alive or something like that. Like,
Not just alive, the personal God.
yeah.
He says it very clearly in one place where he says, যখন তিনি নিষ্ক্রিয় তখন আমি ব্রহ্ম বলে কই, যখন তিনি সৃষ্টি প্রলয় করছেন তখন আমি
Right.
শক্তি বলে কই.
Right.
When that divine reality is niskriya, inactive, then I call it Brahma.
Brahma.
When that same divine reality is creating, preserving, and destroying this universe, then I call it Shakti. So that's a very clear definition of Brahma.
So there are two things. I'm sorry. There are two different things, right? Brahma and Shakti.
The same thing in different aspects. You see, the static and the dynamic aspects of the same infinite divine
Okay.
reality. The static aspect is he calls Brahma.
Uh-huh.
The dynamic aspect he calls Shakti. He uses the beautiful analogy of a snake when
Yes,
it's
right,
coiled up,
right,
Brahman.
right,
That same snake when it's wriggling around,
right.
Shakti.
Shakti. So there, what does it mean by then Brahma Shakti?
Very good. So now this term, first of all, this is a very difficult question. So this is like going deep into the Ramakrishna and Vivekananda literature. Does anyone know where this term Brahma-Shakti comes from? As far as I'm aware, this was coined by a particular direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. Any guesses? Who first used the term Brahma-Shakti? Brahma-Shakti. That's my question. It's difficult. I mean, you probably...
I believe that's the first time I heard it.
Yeah.
Kathamrita. I never.
It's
heard
not
it
in the
before.
Kautamrita. That's why. He doesn't, Sri Ramakrishna doesn't use the term. So, M uses the term. Has anyone read at least parts of what's called Shrima Darshan?
Right.
Shrima Darshan is a multi-volume work of dialogues with M. Many years after Sri Ramakrishna left his body in 1886. M, he had very, very interesting conversations with people who would visit him. And he would talk about nothing but Sri Ramakrishna. And he would say that according to Sri Ramakrishna, God was Brahma Shakti. And I love this phrase. It's very beautiful, actually. Because it captures the difference between narrower philosophies and his own. He believes that the ultimate reality is Brahma Shakti. Brahman in one aspect and Shakti in the other aspect. So it's all inclusive. That's the beauty of it. So now coming back, what is Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta? The formula is Brahma Shakti Satyam. So Shankara says that Brahman ultimately is only Nirguna. He doesn't accept the ultimate reality of Shakti at all. You see? Whereas Sri Ramakrishna holds that Brahman and Shakti are inseparable aspects of the same divine reality. Both are equally real. So that's the first important part of his philosophy. Brahma Shakti Satyam. Next part. What about this world? Jagat Satyam. This world is real as Shakti. This world, every name and form in this world is a real manifestation of Shakti. Now another question for you. Who said Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam? Which of the direct disciples of Sri Ramakrishna said Brahma Satyam Jagat Satyam? I'll give the exact Bengali statement and then I hope one of you should know this, please. Brahma Shatto Jagat Shatto Shabi Shatto Shatte Pran Pradishtito. Brahman is true, Jagat Shatto. The world also is real. Everything is real. Shabi Shatto. Shatte Pran Pratishtito. Life itself, all life, is grounded in truth. Who said this? Who made this remarkable statement?
Holy Mother?
No. No, you're getting warmer though. One of the direct disciples. Not Holy Mother, not Swami Medhanandaji. I'll give you one more guess, and then I'll tell you. No, okay, but good guess.
Swami Vivekananda.
No. Okay, now we're just randomly guessing. Turiyanandaji. On his deathbed, right before he leaves his body, more or less his last words were highly significant. Brahma Shatto, Jagat Shatto. He was a great scholar of Shankara. He knew Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, and he's deliberately reversing it.
But he could really understand what's going on. I mean, he told Thakur that, oh, you're sick, but I don't see that you're sick, and
That's what I'm saying. He's one of the greatest disciples of Sri Ramakrishna, and he's saying this. What was Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy? And he's explaining it in this short formula. Brahma Satyam, Jagat Satyam. So I just add Brahma Shakti Satyam. Of course, Turiyanji means the same thing. He has a letter in Bangla. I have a separate class on this actually, if you're interested, where he explains Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy, and he explains that the ultimate reality, according to Sri Ramakrishna, is Brahman in one aspect, but that doesn't exhaust the nature of ultimate reality. The ultimate reality is equally Shakti, the personal God. It's both. So, when you attain jnana, when you reach the roof, you feel in your heart of hearts, you have the spiritual realization of jnana. You feel Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya. Brahman alone is real. Nirguna Brahman, non-dual pure consciousness, alone is real. What about this world? Not real. What about all these people I see? Not real. What about the personal God to whom all these people pray, I go to church, all these things? Unreal. But there's a further stage in spiritual experience, which Sri Ramakrishna himself realized. Not just him. What about Vivekananda? You mentioned Vivekananda? Swami Vivekananda. Swami Vivekananda, he was fascinated by this Nirvikalpa Samadhi state. He wanted that. That was his supreme goal.
Yeah.
And so he comes to Sri Ramakrishna in Kashipur one day. And he says to Sri Ramakrishna, I want nothing more than just to be immersed in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi. That's what Sri Ramakrishna calls jnana, remember. I want to be a jnani. I'll come down once in a while just to take a little milk so that to preserve the body. Then I'll go back into the bliss of Samadhi. And you might think that his guru will be very pleased with him. No, not at all. He started scolding him severely. Shame on you. You should be ashamed. I thought you would be like a great banyan tree, giving shade to thousands, shade and shelter to thousands. Now I see you're selfish. You only care about your own salvation. Aren't you the one who sings, "O Lord, thou art all that exists"? Aren't you the one? He was a great singer, not in Swami Vivekananda. He used to sing this song, "O Lord, thou art everything I see." What is Sri Ramakrishna saying? In a nutshell, he's saying, jnana is something extremely trivial for you. This is nothing for you. It's a pittance. You are here. You come here to be a vijnani. You are here to help others out of their spiritual ignorance. You're here because your heart is bleeding with compassion for this world that's immersed in suffering, that's sunk in suffering. Shame on you for wanting jnana. You need to be a vijnani. Sri Ramakrishna himself, he says, the Divine Mother has kept me in the state of a bhakta, a vijnani. You see, again, there's a parallel with Buddhism here, Mahayana Buddhism. The vijnani should remind us of the bodhisattva in Buddhism, in Mahayana Buddhism. See, because in Theravada Buddhism, the ideal is to become an arhat, somebody who attains nirvana. And what does it mean when you get nirvana? You don't have to come back. The whole problem is we have to come back again and again. We have to suffer. When you attain nirvana, you're done. This is equivalent to getting mukti in Hinduism. So it's like jnana. But Mahayana Buddhism says there's a much higher ideal than that. That's the ideal of being a bodhisattva. That's the person who has already attained nirvana, and that person can happily leave his body or her body and never come back. But that person chooses to come back. The bodhisattva chooses to come back to this world in order to help others to attain nirvana. You see, so that same kind of spiritual compassion that you find in the Buddhist ideal of the bodhisattva, you find in the Vijnana Vedanta ideal of the vijnani. The person who comes back, not because of our own of our karma. Most of us, we're all here because of our karma. Our karma is pulling us back to this world. Because we're full of desires. And until we exhaust our worldly desires, we'll never realize God. But great souls like Sri Ramakrishna and Swami Vivekananda, they're vijnanis. They don't come here because of their own karma. They come here to help others out of their spiritual ignorance, out of compassion. That's the idea.
I have a question.
Yeah, please. But please take the mic.
So when they were explaining this, were they trying to recommend that you have to go through niti, become a jnani, to then become vijnani?
Yeah.
Or is it two paths which are independent?
Right. It's a wonderful question. It's a very good question. Exactly. So do we all have to first pass through this Advaita Vedanta sadhana and then ultimately attain? It's actually a very complicated question too. The answer would take me probably another hour, but I'll give you a few little seeds here and there. Okay. One thing. First of all, Sri Ramakrishna says again and again, even bhaktas can attain knowledge of Brahman. How? You might be surprised. Not by sitting down and studying Aparokshanubhuti, like you guys do with Savarpyananda. No, he says by God's grace. God, if God chooses, God can give you, even his own bhakta, Brahma Jnana, without even practicing Advaitic sadhana, without even doing the Neti Neti Vichara. That's also possible. So you don't necessarily have to pass through this Neti Neti to get to Vijnana. Now, another part of the answer is, as I said, it's complicated. Sri Ramakrishna often says that only Ishvara Kotis can attain the state of Vijnana. He distinguishes two categories of soul, Jiva Koti and Ishvara Koti. Jiva Koti, Ishvara Koti. Jiva Koti is what he refers to as ordinary jivas, ordinary souls. He says for them, when they attain jnana, if they remain in the state of Nirvikalpa Samadhi for 21 days, what happens? Body drops off. Ekus dina mrityu, dehotag. Then he says, but there's a special category of soul which he calls Ishvara Koti. What is an Ishvara Koti? This is another one of these technical terms that Sri Ramakrishna uses. He defines it very clearly, thankfully. He says, what is an Ishvara Koti? Avatar ba avatarer angsho. Avatars, incarnations, divine incarnations, like Sri Ramakrishna himself, and avatarer angsho, which means those born as part of an incarnation. We can think of Swami Medhanandaji, for instance, born as part of an incarnation of Sri Ramakrishna. Only they, these Ishvara Kotis, can attain the state of Vijnana. But it's even more complicated than that. Because then you might say, well, then we're probably not Ishvara Kotis, so why should we even care about his teachings on Vijnana? That's why it's a little more complicated than that. I'll give you another interesting, I'll come to you in a second. Mahapurush Maharaj, Shivanandaji, another great direct disciple of Sri Ramakrishna. He says in a letter once in Bangla, he says, Sri Ramakrishna didn't give me the stamp of an Ishvara Koti, Chaprashtadaini. Because I think most of us should know this, that Sri Ramakrishna, he named who are the Ishvara Kotis in his inner circle. Swami Vivekananda, Brahmananda, Premananda, he goes on. Niranjana. Mahapurush Maharaj left out Shivanandaji. Shivanandaji says, but by his grace, by Thakur's grace, I have been elevated to the status of an Ishvara Koti. So now, this complicates the matter. Because it means that by God's grace, anything is possible. And even a Jiva Koti can become an Ishvara Koti by God's grace. And then suddenly, these teachings on Vijnana become much more practical. Now, another part of the answer. How is all this relevant to us? I promised that I would come back to spiritual practice and more practical matters. In another place in the Gospel, this is not in the Gospel actually, this is recorded in the Leela Prasanga, Sharadanandaji's biography of Sri Ramakrishna. Sri Ramakrishna is describing Vaishnava sadhana, and one of the main spiritual practices in Vaishnavism is practicing compassion toward others, daya. And suddenly he goes into a high state of bhava, a spiritual state. And then he says, compassion. Who are we to practice compassion? What does he mean by that? He means, see, compassion implies that I'm on a higher level than the person I'm helping. You see, to help someone means that I'm above help, right? So he's saying, who are we to practice compassion? We're worms crawling on the earth. God alone can practice compassion. Where does that leave us? Shiv Gyane Jive Shiva. Shivo Gyane Jive Shiva. For us, what is the most potent spiritual practice that we can engage in this world, in our day-to-day lives, whether you're a householder or a monk? Shiva Gyane Jive Seva.
The love, the bhakti and the love.
Yes. Serve others, not help others. Notice the difference. Shiva, Jive Shiva, Seva. Serve others in a spirit of worship by seeing God in everyone. You see, now coming back to this issue of both in the Bhagavad Gita and in Buddhism, and we find in the Gospel, that philosophy always seems to be intertwined with spiritual practice. Now, coming back to this passage that I read out to you, first this Neti Neti reasoning, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, this world is unreal. Then you get to the Vijnani stage, and then you see, wait a minute, but every single soul I see is a real manifestation of God. Now Sri Ramakrishna in this other passage explains what are the practical implications of this Vijnana philosophy. How should we act in this world if we accept the philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta, Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam? How should we live? Shiva Jnane Jiva Seva. by looking upon everybody in this world as a real manifestation of God. You see, now we have to come back to a little philosophy, just to get some clarity about this. Let's go back to Shankara's philosophy briefly. According to Shankaracharya, only one yoga leads directly to knowledge of Brahman. What is that yoga?
Yeah.
Jnana yoga, the path of knowledge. Right? What does Shankara say about karma yoga? Does anyone know?
Yeah,
Preliminary.
Very good, exactly. You know your Advaita. Karma yoga, bhakti yoga are preliminary disciplines for inferior spiritual aspirants. Inferior in what sense? They have impure minds. They're full of worldly desires. So what's the best practice for them? Karma yoga, bhakti yoga, practice devotion for the personal God, engage in selfless work. Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva, that Sri Ramakrishna will fall under this karma yoga. That's for inferior spiritual aspirants. Until you have a sufficiently pure mind, then what?
Then you do it at
that
Chitta
level.
Shuddhi, then you do
Chitta Shuddhi is-
Atma Vichar.
That's Jnana yoga. Once you attain purity of mind through the practices of bhakti yoga and karma yoga, you become eligible to practice the highest spiritual practice of Jnana yoga, follow the path of knowledge, and you stop practicing bhakti yoga and karma yoga. The same person cannot practice karma yoga, bhakti yoga, and Jnana yoga. Shankara rejects that doctrine. It's called Jnana Karma Samuchaya. He says, wrong. Those different yogas are meant for differing grades of spiritual aspirant.
How about Raja Yoga?
Yeah, and Raja Yoga is not something that's exactly discussed by Shankara directly. He talks about Jnana Yoga, though, this yoga of meditation. Raja Yoga is a term used by Swami Medhanandaji and some others later after Shankara.
So Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga will lead to Jnana Yoga.
Will lead to eligibility to practice Jnana Yoga, and by practicing Jnana Yoga, you attain knowledge of Brahman. This is Shankara's scheme.
So Dhyana Yoga, which is Raja Yoga, it comes before Jnana Yoga, right?
According to Shankara,
Mm-hmm.
the way that Shankara puts it in the Gita Bhashya, for instance, in his commentary on the Gita, is Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga are preparatory disciplines to purify the mind. And he calls, it's not Raja Yoga, like about Dhyana Yoga, this yoga of meditation, concentration, he says is an Antaranga sadhana. It's higher than Karma Yoga and Bhakti Yoga, but lower than Jnana Yoga. So it's a kind of, it occupies an intermediate place. It's the penultimate discipline before you're fully eligible to practice Jnana Yoga. And then you exclusively devote yourself to the path of knowledge. You simply contemplate the fact that you are Brahman, Aham Brahmasmi. You listen to the Mahavakya from a qualified Advaitic Acharya, a guru. And then if your mind is sufficiently pure, that should give you the knowledge of Brahman, basically. That's the idea. Now, keep that in mind. Keep Shankara's framework in mind. Now, how is Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta different? What is the place of Karma Yoga in Sri Ramakrishna's philosophy?
The Jiva Seva and all.
Yeah. Yeah, but remember, Shankara says Karma Yoga is meant for inferior spiritual aspirants. What does Sri Ramakrishna or Swami Medhanandaji say about this, about Karma Yoga, for instance?
It is a different path.
Yes, it's a different path, but they don't go into this game of higher and lower.
Yeah, it's
All of the traditional Vedantic acharyas have gone into this higher lower game. Ramanuja just turns the tables on Shankara and says, what's the highest yoga? It's not Jnana Yoga, it's Bhakti. You're wrong. And your Jnana Yoga, it's a preparatory discipline. And so these games have been going on for centuries. Sri Ramakrishna comes and says, Joto Mot Toto Pa.
Yeah.
As many faiths, so many paths. You see, it's a matter of temperament. If you temperamentally feel inclined to practice the path of knowledge, then wonderful. You'll attain the highest goal through that path. If you're temperamentally inclined toward bhakti, practice bhakti to your heart's content. It's not a lower practice. And you'll realize the highest goal through that path of bhakti. He said, Bhaktas, bhaktora chini hote chai na chini khete chai. Bhaktas don't want to become sugar, they want to eat sugar. What does it mean? It's a preference. It's not about higher and lower. You see? So now, Swami Vivekananda says it absolutely explicitly. All four yogas are direct and independent paths to moksha. This is exactly, he's just channeling Sri Ramakrishna here. You see, what does that mean? It means that this extraordinary spiritual practice of Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva serving others in a spirit of worship by seeing God in everyone. Number one, it's based on the philosophy of Vijnana Vedanta. Unless this world is a real manifestation of God, unless each one of you and every person we encounter is a real manifestation of God, then this practice won't even get off the ground. The world's a dream. Imagine this. I'm in a dream, but I don't know I'm dreaming. This is very common. Every night we dream. Most of us are not lucid dreamers, so we don't know that we're dreaming until we wake up. But now we're in the dream. Imagine we're in the dream. And I see a tree and I see people. I'm talking to people. I see a poor beggar. And my heart is bleeding with compassion for this beggar. And then I go and I try to help that beggar and all this. And then suddenly I become lucid in my dream. I start lucid. I don't wake up. You know what lucid dreaming is, right? It means you're still in the dream, but you're lucidly dreaming, which means I know I'm in a dream. You're not out of the dream yet, but you know you're dreaming. Now, I'm a lucid dreamer and I'm seeing that beggar. Will I continue to serve the beggar? This is an interesting question. One logic is, now I know it's a dream. What's the point in serving the beggar? I know that he's just a figment of my imagination. Why would I do it? So you see the problem. If you really look upon this world as a dream, it pulls the rug out from under seva, serving others. Why would I serve a figment of my imagination? So unless the people in this world are real, the people you're serving are real, how can you really sincerely engage in Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva? You see? So you see the inseparability of these teachings, Brahma Shakti Satyam Jagat Satyam. Why is it relevant? You might say this is all highfalutin philosophy. It's not relevant to ordinary people. Of course it's relevant. Most of you are householders. What does that mean? It means you have all sorts of responsibilities. You're raising children. You're going to work. You have a 9-to-5 job, maybe 9 to 7. Who knows? You're doing a million things. You have to argue with people. You have to scold people sometimes. You can't just run off to a cave and meditate. You don't have that luxury. So what should you do? This is the practical question for every spiritual aspirant. What can I do? Continue to go to your 9-to-5 job. Continue to raise your children. Everything is fine. Sri Ramakrishna is not saying to stop doing those things. Change the attitude with which you do it. Do everything, carry out all of your household duties in the spirit of Shiva Jnana Jiva Seva. Seeing God in everyone, seeing God in your own child. You see, the problem with most of us is we love our children because they're ours. Do we love other people's children as much as we love our own? No. So Sri Ramakrishna would say, he says there are two things. There's Maya and there's Daya. Maya. What is Maya? He says that's selfish attachment to people and things because they're mine. I love my spouse because she's my spouse. I love my children because they're my children. And he says Daya, by contrast, compassion. What is compassion? Having equal love for everyone because you see the same God in everyone. You see, that's the practical challenge in everyday spiritual life. For householders too. You see, gradually you have to wean yourself away from your selfish attachments to the things of this world.
Isn't it Thakur says that they more created,
What?
they more created.
Oh.
Yeah.
Yeah. So
whatever you say, is your motto should be taught,
Yeah, no, yeah. So in another context, it's related, not quite directly relevant, but it's related. He says, we experience all sorts of worldly feelings like lust and greed and anger. What does he say? More philia, though. Give these feelings, these very strong feelings that we have such difficulty controlling. What? Give them a Godward turn. Turn these feelings toward the divine. If you feel lust, lust after the divine. If you feel anger, get angry at God that he's not revealing himself to you or herself to you. Yeah, so that's related in a way. It's another very practical teaching for householders, you see. But what I'm saying is, you might think that all this philosophy is not relevant to householders. It's 100% relevant. It's 110% relevant. See, many of us are initiated. How many of you are initiated? Maybe you don't have to. Okay, yeah. As long as you're not embarrassed about it. Yeah, that means you're given a mantra. In our tradition, a guru gives a mantra. Many of you are disciples of Swanand, like I am, or Sarvadevanandaji, or anyone else. And the guru will tell you typically, you sit in the morning and in the evening and do mantra japa and other things. And often householders, they feel, that's my spiritual practice. I wake up at 5 or 6 in the morning, I sit in the shrine for 5 minutes or 25 minutes or maybe an hour. And then I go on for the rest of the day, my household duties. And then in the evening again for 5 minutes or 10 minutes, again I do my mantra japa. So spiritual, so they kind of make a dichotomy between their so-called spiritual practice in the shrine, morning and evening, and the rest of their life. You see, but Sri Ramakrishna insists that you should not make that distinction. Sister Nivedita, who's one of the most brilliant disciples of Swami Vivekananda, she understood this very well. She said, what was the keynote of Swami Vivekananda's teachings? Henceforth, no distinction between sacred and secular. To labor is to pray, you see. That 9-to-5 job itself, why can't that be spiritual practice? If everything is God, then everything you do can and should be made into a spiritual practice. That's why Sri Aurobindo used to say, all life is yoga. You have to ask yourself, how can I turn this household duty, this daily thing that I'm doing, into a spiritual practice? So a couple of weeks ago in Hollywood, I gave a Sunday talk called Spiritualizing Physical Fitness. Physical fitness, something as mundane as that, or you might even call it worldly. Walking in a park, doing exercise, jogging. I like jogging. I did a long jog in Central Park when I was visiting Sarvapriyanji the other day, a few days ago. Why should you think of that as something separate from spiritual practice? Why can't you spiritualize it? How do you spiritualize it? That's the next question. If it's running, if it's something you do alone, and especially if it's repetitive, swimming, running, repeat the mantra mentally as you do it. Beautiful. You can synchronize the mantra with the breath, with the stride when you're running, with the stroke if you're swimming. And then that's as good as your shrine meditation, you see. Everything you do should be an offering to God. Everything you do should be an offering to God. Bhagavan Krishna says this in chapter 9 of the Gita. Yat karoshi, yad ashnasi, yad juhoshi, dadasya. Yat tapassi kaunteya tat kurushva madarpanam. Whatever you do, it's the most blanket statement possible. Yat karoshi. With no exception. And then he gives some examples, but literally anything you do, washing dishes, raising kids, going to your 9-to-5 job, do it as an offering to me. What happens when you do that? When you change the attitude with which you do the work? That becomes karma yoga. It becomes Shiva Jnani Jiva Seva. And it brings you closer and closer to God. Okay, so I'll leave it there. And now, any questions?
Swamiji, thank you. Very interesting.
Please tell me your name.
My name is Kiran. Very interesting concept. You differentiated between jnana and vijnana. And you were talking about the two lines or two half lines from Shankaracharya. Right?
Yeah, or another text that's traditionally ascribed to him, which may not be his. But in any case, it's definitely a follower of his school. Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya Jivo Brahma Vinapara.
So the third
bit, yeah.
bit sounds very similar to what you were saying about the next
Vijnana. Yeah, I've heard this a lot. But,
so the question for me is like, it didn't sound very different to me.
Right. Okay.
Good. Is there a difference? Is there not difference?
Wonderful question. Yeah. So what he's saying is, you only repeated the first part of the formula, Brahma Satyam Jagat Mithya, but the formula goes on, Jivo Brahma Vinapara. Okay, so let me first parse it, the Sanskrit, then we can go into this. I'll try to answer that question, which is a very good question. Brahma Satyam, non-dual Brahman alone is real. Jagat Mithya, this whole world of names and forms, ultimately unreal. Then, this follower of Shankara or Shankara himself, we don't exactly know, says, Jivo Brahma Vinapara. And each individual soul is none other than that Brahman, which is the only reality. Right? And now the question is very interesting, and I've heard this before. The question is, well, isn't that second part of that statement, isn't that the second phase that Sri Ramakrishna is talking about? Isn't that Vijnana? Every soul is Brahman. My answer is no. But to understand that, we have to get into some philosophical subtleties here. Okay. What does Shankara mean when he says Jivo Brahma Vinapara? That's the first thing. One thing that I see as a problem, honestly, is that Shankara is so popular and so prestigious throughout the world, and especially in India, that this is very common in India actually. There are all sorts of texts, right? And now when a text is written by somebody, the author knows. The best way to popularize this text is to say that so-and-so great figure wrote the text. So Patanjali supposedly wrote all sorts of texts, and Vyasa, a million texts. Shankara, another one of these. A million different texts are ascribed to Shankara. So we have these wonderful devotional hymns like Bhaja Govindam. It's actually called Mohamudgara, but popularly known as Bhaja Govindam. Beautiful devotional text, sung by M.S. Subbulakshmi on YouTube. I'm sure you've heard it. And people say that Shankara's, that traditionally it's ascribed to Shankara. And then they say, so Shankara was a great bhakta. Of course, he was a Vijnani too. And so he taught the same thing as Sri Ramakrishna. Wonderful. Now, one thing that I was taught when I was in training center in Beluma, there was a great scholar of Shankara. He translated Shankara's Sanskrit commentaries on the Upanishads, Bhagavad Gita, and Brahma Sutra into Bangla, from Sanskrit to Bangla. So he understood Shankara inside and out. He said this one thing, and I really take it to heart. He says, if you want to understand what Shankara taught and believed, you have to rely on his commentaries on the scriptures. The Upanishad Bhashyas, the Gita Bhashya, and the Brahma Sutra Bhashya. Whether he composed Bhaja Govindam, not known. We know one other text that he wrote. Does anyone know? There's one other text which is known to be Shankara's, apart from his commentaries. No, that's Nirvana Shatkam, and again, that's most likely a kind of follow. No, Upadesha Sasri, the 1,000 teachings. That's one that's known to be his. Apart from that, all bets are off. I'm not saying that he didn't compose Bhaja Govindam. He might have. Even if he did, you're not out of the woods. Why? Because we still have his commentaries, and we know what he says about bhakti in his commentaries. He doesn't say the most flattering things about bhakti, and he says it's for inferior spiritual aspirants. Now in Bhaja Govindam, he seems to be ecstatically praising bhakti. How do you reconcile what he says about bhakti in the commentaries with what he says about bhakti in Bhaja Govindam? Okay, so this is all kind of a detour with respect to your question. Now, the thing is, if you go to Shankara's commentaries and you try to understand what Shankara himself meant when he said that each individual soul is nothing but Brahman, what you'll find is it's completely different from what Sri Ramakrishna means when he says that everything in this world is nothing but God. Why? Let's go to his commentary on Brahma Sutra. He brings up this very famous mantra from the Chandogya Upanishad. What's the mantra? This is one of the most famous teachings in all the Upanishads. Everything is Brahman. What's the original Sanskrit? Somebody should tell me. All this indeed is Brahman.
Sarvam Brahmamaya.
Almost. Sarvam?
Sarvam Brahma.
Come on, almost there. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. Sarvam Kalvidam Brahma. From the Chandogya Upanishad. All this indeed is Brahman. One of the most famous and powerful mantras in all of the Upanishads. Shankara says, how do we interpret this? He says, what this mantra means is, when you subtract all the names and forms that we see in this universe, what's left is Brahman. There's a chair here. When I subtract the chairness from this chair, what's left is Brahman. There's a table here. When I subtract the tableness of this table, what's left is the same Brahman. When I subtract the Medhanandatva of the Swami Medhananda, what's left is the same Brahman. These are what he calls upadis. The chairness of the chair is an upadi, a limiting adjunct. The godness of the personal God, Ishvaratva of Ishvara, another upadi, limiting adjunct. The tableness of this table, another limiting adjunct. And what does Shankara say about all of these limiting adjuncts? They're ultimately unreal. They never even existed. So when you attain knowledge of Brahman, what happens? All those upadis vanish. All those limiting adjuncts vanish. You see, that means, now coming back to your question directly, Jivo Brahmaiva Naparaha, each individual soul is nothing but Brahman. What Shankara means is, when you subtract, when you remove the jivatva of the jiva, the individuality of the jiva, what's left is non-dual pure consciousness. You see, but he never says that the name and form is Brahman. That would directly contradict his philosophy. Whereas Vijnana Vedanta says that the names and forms themselves are real manifestations of Brahman. Sri Ramakrishna could not be more emphatic about this when he says that I'm doing puja and I see the cat as Brahman. Not that when I subtract the catness of the cat, what's left is Brahman. Or when I subtract the puja vesselness of the puja vessels, I see what's left is Brahman. I see the vessels themselves as Brahman. The names and forms themselves are Brahman. That's why he used a beautiful analogy once in the gospel. It's recorded in the gospel. He says, I sometimes see this entire world as made of wax, as if it's made of wax. Why is this an important analogy? Philosophically, it's a very telling analogy. Have you gone to Madame Tussauds or Ripley's Believe It or Not, where these are like very lifelike figurines made of wax? Nowadays, you get Donald Trump, Michael Jackson, and the other thing. And it seems like it's like the real person there, you see. Made of wax means the names and forms themselves are Brahman. Not that you subtract the names and forms and what's left is Brahman, is only a substratum is Brahman. You see. So that's the difference. The difference is, according to Shankaracharya, you subtract all the names and forms from this world and what's left is Brahman. That means that this world of names and forms is a dream. But according to Sri Ramakrishna's Vijnana Vedanta, each one of you is a living manifestation of God. This is what Swami Medhanandaji used to call practical Vedanta. He said it's wonderful to worship in a temple, in an image. He never criticizes it, but he says, but what is a greater temple than the human body? So what is a higher worship than worshiping God in every human body by serving them in the spirit of worship? Shiva Jnani Jiva Seva. But that won't get off the ground if you dismiss all the names and forms, because then there's nobody left. There's only Brahman, you see. So does that answer the question? Yes, sort of. If you want to follow up, you can take the mic again. Yeah, please give it to Kina.
Thank you, Swamiji. Look, I'm not an expert, I'm no scholar,
Yeah.
but experientially doesn't sound very different to me. I understand that there's a lot of tracing and a lot of technical background that you're describing beautifully, that some of it I'm not aware of, I'm not qualified.
Yeah.
But to me, they both sound the same. But nonetheless, it doesn't matter in the sense that
Right.
I hear the power in what you describe.
Okay, no, I appreciate it. But the thing is, look, it's not me, right? I'm just trying to explain what Sri Ramakrishna taught.
Sure,
I haven't had these
I understand, of course.
Yeah, so now, why does Sri Ramakrishna contrast? The real question is, why does he make such a stark contrast between the outlook of the Jnani and the outlook of the Vijnani? You're saying, why make such heavy weather of this? I don't see it as a contrast. So you're really arguing with Sri Ramakrishna, not with me. So now, what is the nature of this contrast? According to Sri Ramakrishna, that's really the relevant question here. Sri Ramakrishna says, the Jnani looks upon this world as Dhonkatati, as a framework of illusion. The Vijnani, by contrast, looks upon this world as Majarkuti, as a mansion of mirth, as full of divine bliss. Isn't there a contrast there? And in many other places in the gospel, Sri Ramakrishna will say, startlingly, this is kind of like shocking to some sensibilities. He'll say, Jnanis tend to be selfish. He uses this word, Shartapur. Why are they selfish? Because they only care about their own salvation, their own liberation. He says, and then he says, they're like a flimsy piece of driftwood. If even a single crow sits on it, it'll sink into the water. It means they only care about their own salvation. He says, Vijnanis, by contrast, are like great logs, which can carry all sorts of creatures. They're sitting on it, it's not bothered, it's happy, it happily takes across these creatures to the other shore. Again, stark contrast. Vijnanis come here full of compassion. You see, so why, the interesting question is, why does Sri Ramakrishna contrast the Jnani's outlook from the Vijnani's outlook? And I think that there are important reasons.
Thank you.
Sure. Anyone else? No one. I've convinced all of you. Look at that. Wonderful. Don't be shy. So what's the practice? The practice is make every moment of your life a spiritual practice. Try. It's a struggle. We forget, we lapse back into our ordinary worldly kind of attitude. But every moment of life, all life should be yoga. Every waking moment. And repeating that mantra helps you to bring you back to your divine nature.
It's very hard though.
Of course it's hard. Spiritual practice is hard.
Yeah.
Bahunam janmanam ante, we were talking about it in the car. Bahunam janmanam ante jnanavan mam prapadyate. After many lifetimes.
But when they say japat siddhi, but you try to practice them, you get your household work and all this, and then you know. You forget,
Well, can you give her the mic so that other people can benefit from what she's saying?
Well, Holy Mother says in a Japat
Chapati.
right? So you try to do it, follow her direction and all this thing, and in the middle of your household work and all this thing,
Yeah.
and you're concentrating on cooking or doing or conversing, and where is japa? There is no
Yeah.
japa at the time. So
Yeah.
you really cannot follow, at least for me, you cannot follow the instruction, even though I know that could lead me to the.
It's not all or nothing. See, it's not. See, another one of her teachings, which is similar. Somebody asks her upaki or something like that. What do we do? What should we do? She points to an analog clock. Nowadays, you almost never see them with the second hand.
Yeah.
She says, just as that clock is ticking, the second hand is ticking. You go on doing a japa,
Japa, yeah.
mentally repeating the
Right.
mantra. So now you're saying, well, I can't.
I know.
How many of us can? That's true, but doesn't mean you don't do it at all or that you don't try. No,
Not try.
try again until you get it. You see, that's the whole point of spiritual practice. Nobody said spiritual life is easy. Nowadays, the problem is these spirituality apps, meditation apps, and then these spiritual gurus who are kind of, it's like spirituality on the cheap, Just to bring things back to my own personal experience. I moved to India in 2009, right after I got my PhD. And I was doing a 6-month pilgrimage in India before I joined the Ramakrishna order. And I visited Kodaikanal for a few days in Tamil Nadu, right?
Yes.
Beautiful hill station. And I walk into a bakery. And the lady who was the owner there, I was wearing white brahmachari clothes, like I'm going to be a monk. So she looked at me and said, "Oh, what do you plan to do?" I said, "Well, I'm going to join the Ramakrishna mission." And she started smiling. She said, "Oh, why go to all that trouble? Why go spending all those years training to be a sannyasi, renouncing so many things?" She said, "I am a follower of Ramana Maharshi. And what he said is, you just dive into the Atma." She says, "Why don't you just dive into the Atma?" I said, "Because I don't know how to dive. That's no problem." So, but everybody wants shortcuts in spiritual life, but there are no shortcuts. You see, but God's grace is the kind of shortcut, but you have to surrender to God, and surrendering to God is no easy task. You see, that itself is difficult. But we try our best, and Gita says, "Aneka janma samsiddhas tato yati paramgati." In the course of engaging in spiritual practices, in the course of many, many lifetimes, we eventually attain perfection. Now, you might feel like, oh my goodness, this is like, where does that leave us? This should give us hope. Every single one of us will eventually realize God. Every single one of us, without exception. Nobody will be lost. We don't believe in an eternal hell. Nobody is condemned to hell. Sri Ramakrishna says, everybody will be fed. Some people at 6 a.m, other people at noon, other people at dusk, other people at midnight. What does it mean? All these correspond to lifetimes, right? It means some people will get liberation in this birth, other people after 10 births, other people after 10 million births, but nobody will be left out. You see? So we have to do our best. That's the idea. And if you find it difficult while cooking, you forget to repeat the mantra, fine. But the very fact that you're admitting that, and you're honest enough to say that, that's a step in the right direction. And then next time you start cooking, try again. You're going to say, wait a minute, this time I'm going to try to repeat the mantra. And then you might find that you're able to repeat the mantra for 5 minutes longer than you were a few days earlier. That's how you make progress, incrementally. Practice makes perfect. And the ultimate state, by the way, what's the culmination of repeating the mantra in the course of your day? It should culminate in what's called ajapa japa. Ajapa japa, which is what Holy Mother and all these, what is that? That's a state of repeating the mantra automatically. It spontaneously wells up from within. You don't have to consciously repeat it. The whole problem is we have to consciously repeat it. We struggle and then we forget. But when you attain the state of ajapa japa, the mantra will just bubble up. So you're going to, when you don't even know that you're taking the mantra until suddenly you realize, wait a minute, oh, wait, I'm repeating the mantra. You'll find this eventually. If you continue with the practice, you'll eventually attain a state of ajapa japa, when you don't even have to try to repeat the mantra. It just bubbles up from within. Yeah.
My name is Sarita, and I'm asking a question more generally. I've been, I'm much more, obviously much more familiar with Advaita Vedanta by Shankaracharya.
You're much more what by it, sorry?
I'm, much more familiar.
With, yeah.
With the
Yeah, sure.
Advaita Vedanta.
Yeah.
And the question is, when you say, right, what you just said about, the mantra coming to your mind, would it be more the actual mantra, or do you really mean that, you think of God in everything you do, right? Because if you are in a situation where you feel that, you have to be a little tough sometimes, right? If you're working or if you are in a social gathering, sometimes there are things that are being said which you don't agree with, right? And you know that you don't agree with it, and you say something, it's not going to go in, people don't like it. And you just say, okay, I'm going to remove myself from that situation, is probably what is the best way to do it. But would that be what you think about saying the mantra is just thinking of God and saying what is the right thing to do? And just, even though it's not the mantra, it's just a constant remembrance.
Yeah. So I'm not saying that you have to repeat the mantra. There's so many different bhakti practices.
Right.
One very powerful one is mantra japa, which is repetition, mental repetition of the mantra. But Sri Ramakrishna would often say sharan manan, shabada shabat sharan manan, which means always practice remembrance of God. That's what you're talking about. And that can also take the form of bhajans, that can take the form of just thinking of God in any way,
Yeah.
trying to see God in others. That's also another form of sharan manan. Smarana marana would be the Sanskrit, that's in Bangla, it's sharan manan. Yeah, absolutely.
So is there Shravana Mangalam too? Shravana Mangalam?
Shravana Mangalam is this, of course, it's actually from the Bhagavata Purana. It's the epigraph to use that quotation to preface the Kathamrita. Because the very hearing of the nectar-like teachings of Sri Ramakrishna is our Mangala, is auspicious for us, it's beneficial to us. Just hearing his teachings. That's another form of recollection of God, of course. Reading the gospel. In fact, reading the gospel, something as simple as that, 5 minutes a day. I still do it every night. I try. Now when I travel, it gets difficult because it's a big book. Muktidanandaji, one of the trustees in of our order, he gave a beautiful lecture on the gospel where he described. He says, how is reading the gospel a spiritual practice? And he says and he used a Sanskrit term. I think he coined it. Sri Ramakrishna Sannidhya Sadhana. Sri Ramakrishna Sannidhya Sadhana, which means practicing, by reading the gospel, you're practicing the presence of Sri Ramakrishna. It's as if you're transporting yourself. The beauty of this book is that it's not just his teachings. And records every detail of what's going on. Who's in the room? What's the date? What are the surroundings like? What's the weather like? What are they talking about? So the beauty of it is when you're reading it, it's like a kind of virtual reality where you feel like you are in that room with Sri Ramakrishna. It's an incredible feeling, especially in the original Bengali. Ideally, so now in Hollywood, I was telling Devashish that in Hollywood now, there's some even non-Indians, forget about even non-Bengali, but non-Indians who want to learn Bangla, just so that they can read the original teachings of Sri Ramakrishna, because they're so precious.
And the name is in a very
Sorry?
because Amrita is really like nectar.
Yeah, but see, because that original Bengali there's nothing like it. He spoke in this charming, inimitable village Bengali, which just creates this impression on the soul in a very direct way. It's impossible to translate.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Anyone else? Going once? Going twice?
I think we are good.
Let's close with the mantra.
Swami, thank you for coming over here and for such a wonderful, great session. It's a complicated topic, but you really dwelled into every single person in a more practical way, invoking the thoughts, Q&A sessions, throughout the process, and we are extremely, blessed today. And thank you for coming over here. And we would request you every time, you come this side, please check with Devakis and us, and come and give us your courses to us, that is to keep us immersed.
Thank you so much for your active participation. I was very happy that you guys actually interacted, and I think the best classes are ones where everybody makes a contribution. It shouldn't be just top down. Yeah, thank you so much.
And thank you. And just one small note, about a few days ago, last week, Swami Sarvadevananda sent a message to Devashish. During the Labor Day, that is ask your devotees to read the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. That is share some 10 pages or 20 pages like that. So two things that came to my mind, that is when you talk today, that is, I just read the introduction by Swami Nikhilananda, And the way in which the English was written, initially it started with maybe I will read 5 pages or 6 pages, then come back again read. But the way in which the flow happened in English, the introduction, just like talk, didn't go beyond introduction. Only about some 15 to 18 pages went through, and it was really, that is, I didn't put it down. It really like a story it was going. That is. So, and the second one is you mentioned, such an interactive session today. We had it just a message for us, that is go and read at least the Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna for every one of us. We have in the library the English version, and also we have it in the bookstore. That is, if you want, you can buy. If you want additional copies, we can get. And that is, we strongly encourage, that is to read Gospel of Sri Ramakrishna. And also, that is, I think the interactive sessions we had today, it will expand multi-folds, that is during your future visits. And thank you. Now I request Uma to facilitate Swami with a flower bouquet.
And maybe I'll do a closing mantra and then.
Yes.
Om Shanti 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 Hari Om Tat Sat Shri Ramakrishna Paramastu.
Yeah. Thank you. We will have just short 2-3 minutes break around 5:45. Swami, now that is, we will get started with Arti. Thank you.
So then maybe I'll just run to the bathroom. Fine, sweet.
Den jol, den food, den vastra, den jama. Jama, yes, that's what you put.
ওদেরকে একটা বাক্সের মধ্যে দিতে থাকা একটা বাক্স ঠিক আছে আমার 5টা স্টেপ হবে একবার বলে উনি আরেকটা করেন মানে there is another song that I will lady song that yes so 5 items want to go the first one
Then jol,
Sarvadhamani was jewel, shop,
সাথে
then
ওটা
flower,
হুম।
then flowers there,
কোথায় ওখানে?
and the very
তারপর কোথায় রাখবো? ঠাকুর কোথায় রাখবো?
right, then
Okay,
basta,
বস্ত্র
বস্ত্র।
protein, then jama.
তেমন এবার আমাদের আপনি যখন সিগন্যাল করবেন স্টার্টটা
আগে আরো
আরতি মানে খণ্ডনা বাবু
হুম।
আপনি when you are ready
Okay.
মহারাজ অনেক সময় বসে ইয়ে করে দেন মানে
হ্যাঁ, ওইটা আমি
আপনি যদি কোনো না করেন তাহলে আপনি দাঁড়িয়ে করেন সরাসরি when you are ready you start
ওকে।
you just give a signal
হুম।
and শেষে
হুম।
you offer the fruits and then we will take prasad
জ্বালানো হয় মহারাজ ওখানে সামনে রয়েছে একটা পঞ্চ বাজি হ্যাঁ ঠিক
ঘন্টাটা উনি দিতেন
जय श्री गुरु महाराज जी की जय, जय महामाई की जय, जय स्वामी जी महाराज जी की जय।